But by any definition, the president is once again using the virtual bully pulpit to take shots at perhaps his political enemies, or in this case, his fired former FBI director. He says this: Democrats can't find a smoking gun tying the Trump campaign to Russia after James Comey's testimony. No smoking gun, no collusion at Fox News. That's because there was, all caps, no collusion. So now the Dems go to a simple private transaction, wrongly calling it a campaign contribution, which it was not. But even if it was, it's only a civil case like Obama's, but it was done correctly by a lawyer, and there would not even be a fine. Lawyer's liability if he made a mistake, not me. Cohen, speaking of Michael Cohen, his former fixer, just trying to get his sentence reduced, all caps, witch hunt. Now, this comes after Comey's behind closed doors testimony before House lawmakers, about which the president criticized Comey's faulty memory.
There he goes again. I thought I was lying, James Comey. Now I'm leaking, James Comey. We have to remind ourselves, the President of the United States of America is publicly announcing that people are committing crimes, they should be in jail, private citizens. That's not okay.
Of course, it is also possible that Comey, Bill, could once again have to testify. You heard Senator Goodlatte mention that. Lindsey Graham and others have said as much as well, Bill.
The White House saying about the Washington Post story, suggesting Trump campaign officials were in contact with Russians during the transition, Kevin.
Listen, on the record, Bill, they're not saying a great deal. Off the record, they're sort of trying to poke holes in some of the reporting that you've seen out there, in particular in the Washington Post. I want to lay it out slowly for the people at home who haven't had a chance to sort of wash in it the way we have inside the Beltway. What they're suggesting is this idea that General Flynn interacted with officials representing Moscow is not on its face uncommon or even unlawful. The White House officials that I've talked to point to the fact that, among other topics, Flynn is said to have discussed getting the Kremlin to side with the U.S. on an issue involving Israel. However, the Post, citing Michael Cohen's testimony, said that he was also in contact with Russians about building a Trump property in Moscow. And again, their argument is, so what? That's not nefarious, nor is it illegal. But the question obviously becomes, Bill, was there a quid pro quo? And that is yet to be proven. Bill?
All right, one more question for you. What's the latest on a new White House chief of staff and that search, Kevin?
Yeah, a real surprise over the weekend. A lot of people felt like it would be Nick Ayers, the vice president's chief of staff. He is very, very highly regarded here in the nation's capital, and in particular here at the White House. Very strong reputation, but he didn't want to commit to working for the Trump White House through 2020, and so that leaves the outgoing chief of staff, John Kelly, in a bit of a holding pattern, waiting to get his replacement up to speed. That is, of course, depending on who he is or she is. But the general's departure, Bill, is also raising questions about Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. She is said to be very close to Kelly. His departure, it is thought, could signal hers as well. As for possible Kelly replacement, names we're most often hearing here at the White House: Mick Mulvaney, Mark Meadows, Matt Whitaker. A trio there, all qualified. We'll see what, if anything, the president decides to do in the day ahead.
Well, we're still going through the transcript, John. It's over 200 pages documenting that 6-hour closed-door transcribed interview, and certainly an indication of the frustration from the Republican chairman of the House Government Oversight Committee, Trey Gowdy. He put out a statement a short time ago, documented what he described were the number of times that the former FBI director couldn't remember, didn't know, or did not recall. And the figures he released was 71, 166, and then 8, as you see here. And if you do some quick mental arithmetic, you see that's about 230 times in a document that is about 240 pages in length. Some of the topics that he could not provide information on were key topics of interest to the Republicans, which would be the dossier that was used to secure a surveillance warrant on a Trump campaign aide, Carter Page. He could not say who paid for it. He does not recall seeing the key details of the FISA application itself, and he was unaware of this relationship between the former British spy Christopher Steele, who did the research on the dossier, a Justice Department official who helped get some of that information to the FBI in the fall of 2016. The FBI was also getting the dossier, it's important to note, through other channels. And then also this issue of the funding. It was funded by the DNC and the Clinton campaign, but Director Comey says in his testimony in a line of questioning to one of the Democrats on the committee that he just didn't feel that that information about which political party was funding it was really that germane or relevant to the surveillance court. What mattered is that they knew it was some kind of political document, John.
That brings us to the Russia investigation.
That's right.
What have you learned about that based on these transcripts?
Well, going through the transcripts, one of the key headlines, at least to us here at Fox, based on our reporting, is that he documents that in the summer of 2016, when they opened the Russia counterintelligence investigation that was looking at alleged contacts or coordination between Trump campaign officials and Russia, that there were 4 individuals that they were investigating at that time. So we know about the aide Carter Page. He was the subject of the surveillance warrant. We know about George Papadopoulos, who recently pled guilty to lying to federal investigators. But the other 2 are kind of a blank. One could be Paul Manafort, and another could be the former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn, but we're not clear on that at this point. It's important to note that Director Comey goes on to say that there was never a direction from the Obama administration to open the campaign on the Trump campaign at that time. Pardon me. And he says in a line of questioning with the Democrats, quote, "I know that we never investigated the Trump campaign for political purposes." Congressman Deutsch, did President Obama or anyone in his administration ever make a demand or a request the FBI or the Justice Department infiltrate or surveil the Trump campaign? Mr. Comey, no, not to my knowledge. The other footnote I would say in this section is that we have new detail about Director Comey's decision to draft a memo documenting his meeting with the president about the former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. That was a meeting they had in February, and it was at that meeting, according to the FBI director, that the president said, "I want to see if you can let go of this Flynn situation," because Flynn had resigned at that time. What we know from the transcript is that there was a meeting among senior FBI officials about Comey's conversation with the president about Flynn, and based on the transcript, the focus of that is whether it amounted to obstruction of justice. What's worth noting here is that they decided in a very conscious way to keep that information with the FBI and not to share it with then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, because they had already calculated that he would recuse himself from the investigation. And I mention this because it was this type of behavior during the Clinton email case, of the FBI taking over a lot of responsibility of areas that might naturally fall to the Justice Department, that they were highly criticized for doing with the emails. And now we see something similar happened with the obstruction of justice question in the Russia case.
Yeah, and you can tell from reading the transcripts that many members of Congress weren't happy about that decision. What about Lisa Page and Peter Strzok? FBI employees at the time, worked for Mr. Comey. What did he say about them?
Well, I think there's a very important section about Peter Strzok. One of the questions for Republicans has been whether the political bias that was exhibited in the text messages exchanged by Peter Strzok and Lisa Page bled into the investigations, either the email investigations or the Russia investigation. And what Director Comey testified to were Strzok's involvement in that letter in October of 2016, which went to Congress and led them to reopen the email investigation right before the election. And he says in his testimony, quote, "In fact, Peter Strzok helped draft my letter to Congress on October 28th that Hillary Clinton blames for her defeat. So it's hard for me to see how he was on Team Clinton secretly at that point in time. And he also was one of the handful of people in the entire world who knew we were investigating 4 Americans. Remember, we talked about this earlier. 4 Americans who had some connection to Mr. Trump during the summer of 2016, and he didn't tell a soul." So on the one hand, the former FBI director is very critical of Strzok and Page for the anti-Trump bias or political bias that's shown. But he also doesn't throw them under the bus, in the sense that he says here that Peter Strzok was one of the only people who knew about the Russia CI investigation involving the Trump campaign. He did not leak that information. And he also helped draft that letter that went to Congress that reopened the email case on the eve of the election. As the director notes, Hillary Clinton has blamed as one of the main reasons for her defeat in 2016, John.
I know those transcripts have been out just a couple of hours. You've done a great job digesting it on the fly. Catherine
Well, it's
Herridge.
really great reading, actually, if you're interested in this subject. There's a lot of great detail.
Welcome back to Fox and Friends First. Lawmakers sifting through more than 200 pages of transcripts from former FBI Director James Comey's marathon testimony. So what did we learn learn. Joining me now to break it all down is the president of Judicial Watch, Tom Fitton. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you were up late last night, going to be a very busy day again today, so we appreciate your time. Let's get right to it, though. Some of the main takeaways, one of them obviously was that James Comey didn't appear to remember a lot, or he didn't know a lot to begin with. I don't know which it is, but he said, I don't know, at least 156 times, amongst a lot of other variations of that. So what's your take away from that?
Well, it wouldn't be so bad if he professed ignorance on minor topics, but he professed ignorance on a lot of key aspects of the FISA, the details about, for instance, who funded it, because he signed off on at least one of the FISA warrants that targeted Carter Page and the Trump team, and he professed not to know much about the origins beyond what he read in the newspapers later. And, you know, that's concerning given that a review of the partial FISA applications that have been released in Judicial Watch's lawsuits show that the courts were misled, that they were told that this FISA, the dossier, for instance, had origins in a political opposition to President Trump, but wasn't told, the court wasn't told, that the Clinton campaign was behind it.
And let's go to this next point that came out in these pages and pages of testimony, that the anti-Trump dossier was, in fact, unverified.
Yeah, he confirmed what we already knew, that it was minimally corroborated. Remember, Devin Nunes concluded that in his report earlier this year, and he was excoriated by the left for saying that, but it's true. It was minimally corroborated when they first applied to the courts and when it was renewed. And as best I know, it still is minimally corroborated. And remember, the dossier was used by, created with the help of Russia Intel, according to Fusion GPS. So it looks like a smear operation by the Russians through the Clinton camp, with the willing help of the FBI and, frankly, now the Mueller operation.
And that's specifically important, the issue of verification, because intel sources say that presenting a single unverified fact, that throws into account this whole Woods procedure, which needs to be followed in order for this FISA to be granted.
You know, it's one thing to say, hey, look, we like this source, but if they can't find substantiation for what the source is telling them, and they're not telling the court that, that's a real problem.
Okay, so let's move to the next one. The 4 Americans that were apparently under investigation, but not President Trump.
Yeah, so that is important. Those were all people associated with the Clinton campaign, the Trump campaign. They include Carter Page, Michael Flynn, George Papadopoulos, and the 4th name's escaping me. James Comey tried to pretend just because we're targeting 4 people on the Trump campaign doesn't mean we're targeting the Trump campaign. Who's he kidding? And of course, Carter Page was spied upon later in the year.
Yeah, so let's move to the 4th one. He defended the FBI agent, Peter Strzok. He said there was no indication of bias. You just said, you know, who are you kidding? You could probably say that here, too.
Yeah, well, he said that if he was on this is what's really frustrating, because he said if he knew what the texts were at the time, he would have pulled them off the Clinton and the Russia case. But then later, he said it was a conspiracy theory that Strzok was pro-Clinton and anti-Trump. So he wants to have it both ways. And it shows you that Mr. Comey may have some Strzok problems, too, given his biases.
But he's not friends with Robert Mueller. He pointed that out. He said he doesn't have his personal cell phone number, said he hasn't been over to his house, said he's not friends with Robert Mueller. What do you think about that?
You know, there was a Washington Post story not too long ago talking about them being brothers in arms. They're close professionally, and it doesn't matter in the sense that Comey and Mueller had a professional relationship. And Mr. Comey specifically leaked information to get a special counsel going, and now Mueller is using Comey as his witness. And people are concerned about the conflicts legitimately, since they had this long and close working relationship.
And Tom, you're testifying before Congress on December 13th, correct?
Yes, this Thursday on the Clinton Foundation issue. This is the hearing that had been put off a few weeks, and we'll see what happens. But we broke open the Clinton Foundation pay-to-play scandal.
Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.